All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning, good morning. Let us begin. So I want to begin by thanking Baruch Hashem. We have many Talmud Torah sponsors this month. To thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors, to thank Jerry and Appy Applebaum for dedicating the Shurim and Drashos this month in memory of Barbara Friedman, Basya Bas Chaim, and David Friedman, David Ben Avram. To thank Doctors Paul and Linda Weinberg for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month in commemoration of the 36th yahrzeit of their son, Mordechai Yoshua Ben Peretz Moshe Falea Miriam. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack, our Talmud Torah sponsors for this month, for dedicating the Shiurim and Drashos in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Dana Baker Mattson. To thank Stephen Terry Zinn for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drashos this month in honor of the birth of their grandson, Bunim Tzvi Hirsch. To thank Naftali Tilson for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drashos this month in honor of his good friend, Benjamin Wall, and with wishes for a Chag Kosher V'Samech to the entire Shir. And to thank Avram and Shendi Kelman for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month, the commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, all of those who require refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and all of the families in Nechama. With that, it's beautiful to see so many Talmud Torah Drashos, Talmud Torah sponsors. We thank everyone for their incredible generosity. Right, so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph. We are picking up at the Mishnah, at the Gemara on Lamed Amud Beis 30b. So just to reorient ourselves for a moment, if you remember again, we had an interesting case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah began with a statement of Vikulan. Vikulan means we're going back, the Mishnah says, to the 15 women mentioned in the first Mishnah. So a little bit of Chazar. Remember again, what did we do in the first Mishnah? We had 15 women who were exempt from Yibum, right? Totally exempt from the parsha of Yibum. Why? Because they were an erva to the Yavam, right? And remember again, what the Mishnah taught us was that halacha l'maisa, the same way that these women were exempt, they also went ahead and exempted their co-wives. Exempted their tzaros, so we saw tzaros, co-wives, fine. Our Mishnah introduced us to an interesting question. So let's imagine the following scenario. You have Reuven and Shimon. And imagine for a moment that Shimon is married to Reuven's daughter. Totally permitted. Shimon married his niece. We'll call her Rachel. Shimon also has another wife, unrelated woman. We'll call her Leah. So we'll say in a typical situation, if Shimon were to die, what does Reuven do? Nothing, right? Because remember again, who falls to him in Yibum? Two women, one of them who happens to be his daughter, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the same way that she is exempt from Yibum, so her co-wife is exempt from Yibum as well. The Mishnah is dealing with the following situation. Let's say, when Shimon married Rachel, his niece, there was a Safek Kiddushin, questionable aspect of the Kiddushin. Or for that matter, Shimon divorced his wife Rachel, and what? There was a questionable gerushin. And before the doubt regarding Kiddushin or gerushin got resolved, what happened? Shimon died. So now, both you have a very interesting case where now this doesn't impact, it does, but not as much Rachel, because Rachel anyway wasn't subject to him, but who it does impact ultimately is Leah. Because we'll say, what did we establish in yesterday's daf? Hopefully you listen to the Chazara, right? What was the key point of yesterday's daf? That when is Yibum eligibility established? When is it established? At the moment of widowhood, right? So remember again, so whether or not Shimon was married to Rachel at the time of his death is incredibly important because it determines Leah's eligibility or prohibition in Yibum, right? But again, this is a case of Safek. So what do you do in a case of Safek? So the Mishnah says, okay, Hare Elu, the Tzaros Leah is going to be Choltzos v'lo Misyabos. So Leah will do Chalitza, won't do Yibum. That's the end, right? So that's what it is, which is not like such a shocking conclusion. It makes sense. She's going to do Chalitza. She won't do Yibum. I will say the Mishnah then went on to get into the cases of what's Safek Kiddushin and what's Safek Gerushin. So the case of Safek Kiddushin, remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah gave an interesting case. A man is throwing Kesef Kiddushin. He throws a ring, right? He throws a Kesef, he throws money, right, for Kiddushin at a woman. And what was the case of Safek Kiddushin? Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov Lo. Did it land in his Dalar Amis, her Dalar Amis? And again, it never got resolved. That's a case of Safek Kiddushin. What's Safek Gerushin? So the Mishnah went on a whole bunch of cases. The husband writes the get, but there's no signatures of witnesses. There's witnesses, but there's no date. There's date, but there's only Eid Echad. Fine. We'll say good. Says the Gemara. Here we go. Ve'ilu begerushin Safek Karov Law lo katani. So we'll say the Gemara just makes an interesting observation, which is, it would have been easy enough for the Mishnah to use the same example by both cases, right? Where the Mishnah was saying, what's the case of Safek Kiddushin? So what did the Gemara say? Again, he threw her Kesef Kiddushin. It's a Safek. Is it closer to her? Is it closer to him? Okay. You could have used the same exact case by Gerushin, right? A man takes a get. He throws a get to his wife, and what happens? It's Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov Lo. Rabbi say, by the way, that is a case in Meseches Gittin. So why not just use the same case by both Safek Kiddushin and Safek Gerushin? Why do you have to come up with different cases? To which the Gemara says, my time. Well, what's the reason? Amar Rabbi, this is actually quite fascinating. So Rabbi says, Isha Zu. So let's analyze this. This woman. Now we'll say, the woman in question, remember over here, is Leah, is the Tsaras Erva. This woman, Leah, Isha Zu b'cheskas heter l'shuk omedes. Now we'll remember again, what's Leah's chazaka? This is fascinating. What's Leah's chazaka vis-a-vis Yibum? What's her chazaka? That she doesn't need it, right? Her chazaka heter l'shuk means when her husband dies, she can marry whoever she wants, right? That's what it means. Her chazaka is that she is the co-wife of an erva, right? That's her chazaka. So the Gemara says, "Umisafek ata bali osra, al ta'asrani misafek." So what are you going to say? You're going to say ultimately again in a case of Safek Kiddushin, Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov Law, you're going to go ahead now and make her subject to Yibum Alt Safek. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. So Rabbi says, it's interesting. So Rabbi says, therefore, look, Rabbi says, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Al ta'asrana misafek, aval bahanoch gimel gitin lav misafek asrin alav, the hagitahu elet she'ein min hamuvchar. See, Rabbi say, what Rabbi is saying is like this. You're not going to asr a woman als safek, right? That you're not going to do. You're not going to go ahead and make her asr als safek. The problem is, if you use a case of karov law, that is a case of safek, and you're not going to allow safek to undermine her chazaka. Her chazaka is that halacha l'maisa, she is permitted to go ahead and marry anyone she wants upon the death of her husband. Upon the death of her husband. Amalei Abaye says, 1 second. Ihachi b'kiddushin nami, neima isha zu b'chazkas heter liyavam omedes, umisafek ata bali osra. So Abaye says, okay, well, you can make the same argument. By the way, Rashi points out the other cases of Gittin, right? The case of where it's written in his handwriting, but ultimately no signature of the witnesses, or the case of there's no Zman. Those are not cases of Safek Get. Those are cases of Gittin that technically are effective, but are not min hamuvchar, are not really ideal. So what Rabbi is suggesting is, we're not going to use a case of real Safek by Gittin, because this case of Safek by Gittin clashes up against her chazaka. So you want to tell me now there's a Safek, is she divorced, is she not divorced? Her chazaka is that what? What's her chazaka? She's married. And in that chazaka, what's the impact of that chazaka on her Yibum status? She's not subject to Yibum, because she's the co-wife of an erva. You're not going to allow a Safek to come along and undo, or I should say undermine or erode her chazaka. So the Gemara says, Abaye says, well, if that's the case, Yachi b'kiddushin nami. So say the same thing by Safek Kiddushin. They both say, what effectively happens by Safek Kiddushin? Neima, let's say, Isha zu, the tsaras erva, so we'll call Leah, b'cheskas heter liyavam omedes. They both say, before the case of Safek Kiddushin, remember again, the case of Safek Kiddushin is in what case? We're not sure, is Reuven married to Rachel or not? So before the Safek, what is Leah's chazaka? Her Yibum chazaka. What's her Yibum chazaka? That she could do Yibum, right? Because again, there's no other wife in the picture. Now you're going to introduce a Safek Kiddushin, and because of Safek Kiddushin, you undermine her ability to do Yibum with Reuven. Umisafek atabali osra, al ta'asrani misafek. To which the Gemara says, here's the difference. Hasam l'chumra. I will say ultimately, again, by the case of Kiddushin, ultimately, again, the Safek produces a chumrah, right? What's the chumrah? The chumrah ultimately, again, is that you're going to require chalitza. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, Hai chumrah da asli de kulahu. That's fine that it produces an immediate chumrah, but it could be what we call a chumrah that leads to a kula. How so? Because sometimes her husband will go ahead and be mekadesh her sister kiddushe vadai, and will do so with an unquestionable kiddushin, or ve'inami zimnin da'asa acher umekadesh la ledida, or maybe another man will give this woman who had the safek kiddushin actual vadai kiddushin, kiddushe vadai. And if you go ahead and you say that in the case of Safek Kiddushin, the co-wife is not permitted to do Yibum, Omri, what people will say is, the Kama Kiddushin, it must say that the first Kiddushin is a good Kiddushin, Udebasr Lav Kiddushin, and the second Kiddushin that was given either by the husband to the sister or by another man to the same woman, Lav Kiddushin. We'll say, and then what happens? And then what will end up happening is, she'll be released from the second marriage without a get. And that is problematic because halacha lamaisa, we have a safek case, top of Lamed Aleph. No, it's not a problem. Why? Kevan de kametz rachas l'chalitza made de yadai de chumra ba'almahu. Since we require chalitza, ultimately people know that halacha lamaisa, it's only a chumra. Ihachi gerishin nami lisni v'litzricha chalitza. If that's the case, then why don't you rule the same way in the case of Gerishin and require Chalitza and say, Umeida Yadi, the Chumra Ba'almahu. People will know that the way you're ruling is a simple Chumra. Im Ata Omer Choletzes Mis Yevamos. Here's the problem. See, I will say, although it's tempting to always say that when in doubt, just do Chalitza, there's a danger. What's the danger? Remember again, Chalitza is the other side of this coin of, or I say the other side of the coin of Chalitza is Yibum. And there's always this almost like inherent danger that when Chazal tell you to do Chalitza, people interpret that to mean Chalitza or Yibum. Or Yibum. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami, so why don't we say the same thing in the case of Safek Kiddushin? Im ata omer choletzes misyavemes. Sebos, in the case of Safek Kiddushin, aren't we also concerned that if halacha l'maisa you tell her to do Chalitza, the tsaras erva, Leah, to do Chalitza, ultimately, again, isn't there a concern that she may come to do Yibum? To which the Gemara says, well, what's the worst case scenario? V'tisyabim. So let her do Yibum, ve'in bekach klum. And it's not the biggest deal. Why is that? Achazaka kakaima. I will say, what's the worst case scenario if Leah, the tsaras erva, and remembering I will say, the case over here is where Rachel, the erva wife, has Safek Kiddushin. So we're going to tell her, you know what, now Shimon dies before the whole Safek Kiddushin is resolved. So what's the halacha? We tell Leah, do Chalitza. Do Chalitza. The Gemara says, but aren't we concerned that people assume Chalitza, Yibum are interchangeable, and therefore if you tell her to do Chalitza, she may end up doing Yibum, to which the Gemara says, so what? Let's say she does Yibum. If that's the worst case scenario, it's not so bad. Why? Because remember, we'll say, what's her chazaka? The chazaka is that she's the only wife, right? The chazaka is that ultimately, remember again, chazaka is the last presumed state before any level of safek got mixed in over here. So when you have a case where, right, Shimon, the brother, is married to Rachel, who's his niece, and to Leah, unrelated wife. And with Rachel, there's Safek Kiddushin. So we'll say, so now Shimon dies before Safek Kiddushin is resolved. So now, what do we tell Leah? Now Rachel doesn't have to do anything, right? But what do we tell Leah? Do Chalitza. The Gemara says, aren't you concerned that if you tell to do Chalitza, then people are going to assume that, well, see, if you tell Rachel to do Chalitza, what are you effectively communicating? That Shimon wasn't really married to Rachel. Right? Because if he was really married to Rachel, who is his niece, then what would Leah need? Nothing. The fact that you're requiring her chalitza seems to indicate that Allah Chalamais, you're saying they weren't really married. To which the Gemara says, well, aren't you concerned that what happens if Leah ends up going ahead and does Yibum? To which the Gemara says, okay, she does Yibum. In other words, doing Yibum is just reflective of her chazaka. Her chazaka is that she was the only wife. So it's not ideal. But if that's the worst case scenario, it's fine. To which the Gemara says, Abaye raises a kasha. What's an interesting case? Nafal habayis alav Vial bas achiv. So we'll say, so just before we get to the Esvei, so just understand what's happening over here. The Gemara is actually asking a very simple question that kind of blows up into something much bigger. The simple question is, why don't you just use the same case for Safek Gerushin and Safek Kiddushin? By Safek Kiddushin, you brought down the case of Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov Law. He throws her Kesef Kiddushin, we're not sure. Is it closer to the woman? Is it closer to the man? And yet, by the case of Safek Gittin, you didn't mention that case, but you could just use the same case for both. What's the big deal? Rabbah explains, it's very simple. By Gittin, if there is a Safek Gittin, a real Safek, then halacha l'maisa, we will treat her based on her chazaka. What's the chazaka? And by the way, the her that we're referring to is really who? Who's the her? Who's the her? It's Leah, right? Remember again, because remember, we're focusing on this, we're looking at this from a Yibum perspective, right? Now, the her, in other words, the woman who has the Safek Gerushin, that is Rachel, the Erva wife. But the impact of this case that we're trying to measure is on Leah, the unrelated wife. So remember again, about what's happening over here. Shimon is married to two women, Rachel, his niece, Leah, unrelated wife. Shimon divorces Rachel. There's a problem with the Gerushin. It's what we call Safek Gerushin. Before they're able to go ahead and resolve the doubt, what happens? Shimon dies. So I will say, so the truth is, this case has an impact for Rachel also. Is Rachel a grusha? Is she an almana? Right? Is she a divorcee? Is she a widow? That has ramifications for her. But remember, this is Maseches Yevamos. So we are all Yibum all the time, right? So remember again, we have only one focus over here. My focus is, what is now the impact on Rachel? So now Rachel is now a widow. Is she, it's a Safek Gerushin, so is she the co-wife of an Erva or not? So we'll say, so remember again, so what does the Mishnah say? So the Mishnah says, just do chalitza. So remember, okay, fine, that's the case. So just walk you through it again. So now the Gemara says, why don't you just use the same case of Safek? Man threw a get to his wife, Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov La. Rabbah says, I'll tell you why. Because in a case of real Safek by Gerushin, we will address Yibum through the unrelated wife's chazaka. And I both say, what was her chazaka? Co-wife of an erva. That was her last known state. Her last known vadai state was co-wife of an erva. So in a real case of Safek Gerushin, Safek Karov Lo, and then Shimon dies, what would be Leah's obligation vis-a-vis Yibum? Nothing, because we established her based on her chazaka. Her chazaka is that she is the co-wife of an erva, the co-wife of Rachel, and she is free to go without anything else. Good. So let's say, so now comes along Abaye. Abaye says, 1 second. Esvei Abaye, this is an interesting case. Nafal Abaye, Alav Yabas Achiv, Vein Yadua Eize Mehem Meis Rishon. Says, listen to this case. Same case. Reuven and Shimon. Shimon is married to Rachel, Reuven's daughter, and another wife, Leah. Unrelated. Reuven and Rachel walk into a house. The house collapses on them. And now they both die. They both say, what's the shaila? Who died first? And I both say, why does this make a difference? It makes a huge difference vis-a-vis Yibum. Why? Let's play this out. If Reuven died first, then what? What's Leah's obligation? If Reuven died first? No obligation. Why? Because when Reuven dies, so Leah is the co-wife of an erva, and therefore no Yibum, no Chalitza. What happens if Rachel died first? If Rachel died first, then what? Then ultimately again, Rachel dies first, Reuven dies second, which means at the time that Reuven died, he was only married to one woman. Which woman? Leah, unrelated woman, in which case she is chayeves in Yibum and Chalitza. Incredible. So we'll say, so now in this case, Reuven and Rachel die, but I don't know who died first. What's the halacha? Ultimately, again, okay, so it's kind of predictable outcome over here, right? So Leah does chalitza. She does chalitza, she can't do yibum, right? We can't let her do yibum because at the end of the day, we don't know, is she allowed to do yibum or not? So remember again, you can't be flippant about yibum for one simple reason. If you're wrong, then what? If you're wrong, it's an erva, right? It's a mamish and erva. So again, and you run the potential of mamzerus, right? So you can't be now again. Chalitza is easy, right? Because at the end of the day, if you needed it, great. If you didn't need it, it does leave a residual impact on the woman. It does. We'll learn about that. But lamaisa, the stakes are aside. The Gemara says, "V'amai." Why don't we say over in this case, "Hachanami nema isha zu becheskas heter l'shakol medes"? I don't understand. Why don't we just use chazaka? They will say, what is Leah's chazaka? Right? What's Leah's marital chazaka? What's her chazaka? That ultimately, again, if her husband were to die, when we say her chazaka, we mean like, what's her chazaka vis-a-vis yibum? What's her yibum chazaka? She doesn't need it. Because remember again, she is the co-wife of an erva. So her yibum chazaka is that she does not need yibum. So why don't we just go ahead and say, establish her based on her chazaka, and now again, misafek atabali osra, al tasra misafek. Why do you require to do chalitza? Say, Leah, your yibum is that you are the co-wife of an erva. Your chazaka is that you're the co-wife of an erva, and therefore you're not subject to yibum. Let's keep with that chazaka. Now you're going to tell me we're going to make her do chalitza. So essentially what you're doing is, you're making her asura misafek. V'chitema hachanami l'chumra. All right, maybe you'll say you're just being machlin over here. Well, chumra da asili de kulahu. Once again, I will say this is a chumra that could lead to a kula. How so? She'im at omer choletzes misya bemes. I will say once again, although it's always tempting to say just do chalitza, but lemaisa again, when you mandate chalitza, it's possible that people may be confused and ultimately do yibum as well. To which the Gemara says, here's the difference. Gerushin d'shchichi gazubu rabbanon. They both say in the case of gerushin, which is common, that's where Chazal stepped in and said that in a case of safek, you're not going to undermine her chazaka. Mapoles delo shchichi lo gazu rabbanon. But I will say people dying in building collapse. So again, or I should say husband and wife dying in building collapse together, that's not as common. And therefore again, Chazal were not gozer in that case. Inami, if that's the case, Gerishin, the kaima erva de kamuchach, vitsarasa, kamitzrachis la chalitza, amri kamu be rabbanon begita, digita ma'al yuhu. But here's the problem. Even in the case of Gerushin Abosai, we know, for example, in this case where Shimon is married to Rachel and to Leah, that Rachel is an erva. We know that. We know that. And ultimately, again, we also know that halacha l'maisa, now you're requiring Leah to do chalitza. And we also know that there was a get in this question, right? Now it's a safek get. Now, isn't it easy to assume, if you look at this circumstance, the fact that Chazal are requiring Leah to do chalitza, that it must be that what? It must be that halacha l'maisa, the get was a valid get. Because everyone knows about the erva, everyone knows about the get, and the fact that now you're requiring Leah to do chalitza tells us that the get was a valid get. Are we not concerned? Asulia bume litzara. That ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, Leah may end up doing yibum. To which the Gemara says, mapolas, mi kamabu rabbanim mapolas. Archaz, right, we'll say when it comes to the case of collapse, so ultimately there's no real way to ascertain. Right? There's no way to determine who died first. V'gabi gerushin milotnan. V'gabi gerushin milotnan. And ultimately, again, by gerushin, haven't we learned that safek gerushin requires chalitza? We learned the following case. Vatnan. Haisa omedes pershus rabim v'zar kula karov lo migureshes. Karov lo eina migureshes. Supposed to here it is. Here it is, right? The Gemara is trying to say, no, we don't like the case of safek gerushin. Here is the case of safek gerushin. A man has a get in his hand, and he wants to divorce his wife. They're standing in Rishus Harabim, in the public domain. So we'll say, in the public domain, we assume that people still have what? Dalaramas. Right? You have your personal space, your private space in Rishus Harabim. So a man goes ahead and throws a get to his wife, and it's a safek, Haisa. Karav la migareshes, karav la in migareshes. If the get lands closer to her, she is divorced. If it lands closer to him, she's not divorced. Mechza al mechza, migareshes ve'ina migareshes. If it lands mamish equidistant between the two, then what? She's divorced, but she's not divorced. Which means what? Safek migareshes. Safek migareshes. V'armina lamay hilchasa. And I will say, the Gemara says, so tell me, what are the practical implications of being safek migareshes? Here we go. Dikoin hu Asurale. So I will say what it tells you is number one, if the husband is a kohen, I will say let's say a man throws a get to his wife, and it lands mamish, mechzo mechza, half by him, half by her. And then you know what? He decides, you know what? We could work this out. He wants to reconcile with her. So remember again, a man is permitted to remarry the woman he divorced as long as what? She has not married anyone else in the interim, with one exception, a Kohen. Right? A Kohen, remember, a Kohen is not permitted to marry a divorcee, and a Kohen can't even remarry his own divorcee. So in a case of Safek Migureshes, halacha l'maisa, the Kohen would not be permitted to go ahead and remarry his Safek Migureshes wife. The ervahi sarasa bayi chalisa. Furthermore, again, let's say this was the case where Shimon, the husband, right, threw this get to his erva wife. When I say erva wife, she's not an erva to him, right? She's an erva to his brother, right? So he threw it to Rachel, who is his niece, Safek Migureshes. What will we do in this case? Sarasa bayi chalisa. His other wife, Leah, would require chalitza. So we'll say, so here is pretty explicit. What do you see over here? That in a case of Safek Migureshes, we will require chalitza, and we don't just simply rest on her previously established chazaka. And we don't say that we're concerned that if you make her do chalitza, she's going to end up doing yibum. We learned about this. Rabbi V'Rav Yosef, Darmi Tarvayu, Hacha b'shtei kite edim askinan. Oh, I will say, what's the case over here? The way the Gemara sets up the case, we're talking about a case where there are two groups of witnesses. Achas omeres karov lo, va'achas omeres karov lo. One set of witnesses says the get landed closer to him. One set of witnesses say the get landed closer to who? To her. Sorry. So the Gemara says the havile sveka d'oraisa. Oh, so I'll say that's a case of safek d'oraisa. Two conflicting groups of witnesses. So in a case of a Safek Da'araisa, then Einachinam, you'll have to go l'chumra, you'll make a Leah, the unrelated wife, do chalitza, and you won't be able to just simply say, allow Leah to rely on her chazaka. Umas nisan dahacha bekas achas. It must be that our Mishnah is dealing with a case where there's only one set of witnesses, or in other words, one witness, karov la, right? Fine. We'll say, how do you know that our Mishnah is only dealing with one set of witnesses? Ultimately, just like by Kiddushin, we're dealing ultimately with one set of witnesses. So to by Gerushin, we're dealing with one set of witnesses. How do you know by Kiddushin we're only dealing with one set of witnesses? Maybe it was two sets of witnesses. So this is very interesting, because if we were dealing with a case of Safek Kiddushin with two sets of witnesses, then Abba say, you know what effectively happens? They cancel each other out. And halacha l'maisa, then we establish Leah based on her chazaka. And her chazaka was that she was the only woman married to Shimon, in which case when Shimon dies, she is eligible for yibum. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, Kaimi eidim v'kamri karov la v'at amr tisyav ve'im v'kachlum. Does that make any sense? There are witnesses that say karov la. And ultimately, again, you're going to say that Leah could just do yibum and there's no problem. Furthermore, again, even when you have two conflicting sets of witnesses, that is still a safek d'Rabbanan. How so? I will say, in general, whenever you go ahead and you have two conflicting sets of witnesses, what do they effectively do? They cancel each other out. So now what? What I do is I rely on chazaka. And chazaka says whatever your status was prior to the witnesses, that's what we put you back on. And if that's the case, at least in this case of Safek Kiddushin, that would allow Leah to do Yibum. To which the Gemara was very interesting. This is comparable to the case of the property of Bar Shatya. Now we'll say Bar Shatya was a guy. We're going to see that Bar Shatya, we'll say, was a guy who had episodic moments of insanity. Right? Or I would say he had episodic insanity. Right? In other words, that sometimes he was totally lucid and sometimes he was out of it. A lot of people like that. Right? I would just say, right? So I might say, right, but again, I will say, so this is a fascinating case because in general, remember again, if a person is a shota, by the way, that's what Rashi points out, it's possible that his name was not actually Bar Shatya, right? Bar Shatya, Shatya is like a shota. It could be that his name is Bar Shatya. It also could just be descriptive. And it's descriptive of a fascinating case, which is a guy who has moments of lucidity and capacity, and then at other times fundamentally lacks capacity. So remember again, anything a shota does is not halachically meaningful or viable. So the problem you had with this guy Bar Shatya is he was engaging in real estate transactions. He was in real estate, a good Jewish boy, right? He was in real estate. And what happened? So the shaila was, like, are his transactions binding or not? So look at the Gemara. The Bar Shatya, Zabin Nechasi. Bar Shatya bought some real estate. He bought some property. So the Gemara says, Asu beitrei va'amri kishu chalim va'zabin va'asu beitrei va'amri kishu shot zabin. And we have two different sets of witnesses. One set of witnesses said, now apparently now the transaction came under some dispute. One group of witnesses says he was totally lucid. Totally lucid. The other group of witnesses says, no, totally out of it. He was a shota. So what do you do? From Ravashi, this is actually fascinating. From Ravashi, uki trila bahadi trei. Here, look, here's what we do. We put the two witnesses together on the same level. So what happens when you put the two witnesses side by side? So essentially what happens over there, uki trila bahadi trei, the witnesses cancel each other out. So effectively, from a testimonial perspective, what do I have? Nothing. So in the absence of not having any testimony and not being sure, was Bar Shatya lucid or not, the only thing I could rely on is chazaka. And what does chazaka say? Amid Beis, Amid Alf, Amid Beis, Va'ara ukma becheskas Bar Shatya. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So we'll say now, remember again, when it comes to monetary law, chazaka is determined by what? Possession. So remember again, in this case over here, Bar Shatya already had possession of the real estate. He had possession of it already, right? So Lamaisa, the Gemara says there's something fascinating. So I have Ukich, so again, a witness is saying he's lucid, witness is saying he's insane. All right, so pretty much they cancel each other out, and all I could rely on now is chazaka. It's chazaka. In this case again, the chazaka ultimately being that Bar Shatya is in possession of the property, so that makes him the owner. So you see over here that halacha l'maisa, when you do have effectively no testimony. So remember, it's interesting in halacha, there are two cases of no testimony, right? What's the first case of no testimony? No testimony, no witnesses, right? What's the second case of no testimony? Two groups that say the exact opposite things. So again, obviously we do our Jusha v'chakira, maybe someone's lying, but assuming we do our Jusha v'chakira and they're both found out to be legitimate, they effectively go ahead and cancel each other out. And what I'm left with then, the mechanism of resolution in a case like that is chazaka, the last known state. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So therefore I will say, remember, this whole thing up until this point in time has been Rabbah, right? And remember, I will say it's so interesting. Like when you look at this, we're actually trying to address a very simple question. We're just trying to figure out, why did the Gemara not use the paradigmatic case of Safek Kiddushin, right? Remember again, the way the Gemara, Mishnah, described the cases of Safek Gerushin is are cases of a get that's just not really an ideal get. Right? Why don't we use the paradigmatic case of Safek Gerushin, which is the same case as Safek Kiddushin? A man took a get, threw it towards his wife. We're not sure. Safek Karov La, is it closer to her or is it closer to him? And the matter never got resolved. And then the husband, Shimon, dies. Why don't you just use that case? So Rabbah's answer to that was what? Because if you had a real Safek, a real Safek cannot undermine her chazaka of what? Of being a married woman. And therefore, again, what we would say is, therefore, Rachel is married to Shimon. And therefore, Leah is totally exempt from Yibam or Chalitza. So the Gemara just lodged a whole bunch of questions on that. This now leads Abaye to advance a different approach. Abaye, Amr Abaye, will say second line, Laman Alpha and base. Amr Abaye, Yogid Alav Reo. So I will say the Gemara is quoting the pasuk from Eov. So literally, Yagid Alav Reo means its fellow will shed light on it. In other words, what Abaye is saying, he's quoting the pasuk meaning what? Tana b'kiddushin, badin l'gerushin. The truth is, whatever case the Mishnah gave for Safek Kiddushin, the Mishnah automatically means you could apply that same case for Safek Gerushin as well. We both say, you see, we don't have to quote the same cases back and forth because we assume whatever is going to be a Safek Kiddushin will also translate into a Safek Gerushin. Tana Begerushin, Voadin Kiddushin. So Abaye says, wow, you guys are really getting too caught up in the wording of the Mishnah. When we talk about right in the Mishnah, talk about two cases, Safek Gerushin and Safek Kiddushin. You don't have to articulate the same exact examples in both scenarios, because it's understood that whatever case creates a Safek Kiddushin also creates a Safek Gerushin, and whatever case creates a Safek Gerushin also creates a Safek Kiddushin. Why is everybody getting all excited? Amarle Rava said, 1 second. I yagid alav reo my zehu diktani. So I'll say, if that's the case, that the cases are mamish all interchangeable, then why does the Mishnah say zehu? We'll say the Mishnah says zehu safek kiddushin, zehu safek gerushin. So we'll say zehu makes it sound like the examples articulated are unique to Safek Gerushin, and the examples articulated are unique to Safek Kiddushin. Why zehu? Ela Amarava, rather Rava says, Koshi yesh bekiddushin yesh begerushin. Rava, so we'll say Rava has a modified version of Abaye. And Rava says like this, here's the truth. Any case that's a Safek Kiddushin ultimately will be a Safek Gerushin as well. Which I will say is nice, because what does that mean for us now? The case of what? Safek Karov Law. Safek Karov Lo, which in the Mishnah was associated with Safek Kiddushin, also applies where? In Safek Gerushin. However, here's the important caveat. B'yesh, begerushin, mashe'in b'kiddushin. But I will say it doesn't work the other way. There are cases of Safek Gerushin that don't translate into cases of Safek Kiddushin. So I will say, so just to understand what's happening over here, Abaye wanted to go with the approach that all of the cases of Safek Gerushin, Safek Kiddushin are all interchangeable. The Gemara says that can't be because the Mishnah used lashon of zehu. This is a case of Safek, which indicates to us that the Mishnah is limiting the application of cases from one context to another. To which Rava says, you're right. It really goes in one direction, meaning any case of Safek Kiddushin is going to also be a case of what? Safek Gerushin. Which you're going to say for our purposes means one thing, which is what case? What case? Safek Karov Lo, right? Same way if he throws a get. Safek, is it closer to her, closer to him? Safek Migureshes. If he throws Kesef Kiddushin, Safek Karov Lo, Safek Mikudeshes. However, when it comes to Gerushin, there are cases of Safek Gerushin that do not find expression in the world of Kiddushin. The Gemara says, Shma she'en kein bekiddushin, v'zehu de Gerushin lav dafka. And even though the Mishnah uses lashon of zehu by Gerushin, which is limiting, it's lav dafka, it's not specific. El mishum de tana zehu bekiddushin, tana nam zehu begerushin. So I'll say ultimately again, it's just coming to include Mishnaic symmetry. He says the Gemara, v'zehu bekiddushin. So I'll say, so now that we've established that halacha l'maisa, anything that comes by Kiddushin, right? Any case of Safek Kiddushin, ultimately again will be Safek Gerushin. But there are cases in Gerushin that will not translate into Safek Kiddushin. To which the Gemara says, so what is the Zeh in Kiddushin? What is it coming to limit? Here we go, I'll say. Zman. Let's go through the examples. So I will say, one of the examples of Safek Gerushin in the Mishnah was what? A get that didn't have a date. You didn't date the get. So if a man gives his wife a get without a date, it's Safek Migureshes. Safek, he'll say, what happens, one of the ways in which a man could be Mekadesh, a man could betroth the woman is how? Shtar. Let's say you give your wife a Shtar Kiddushin without a date. So the Gemara says the truth is, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, it doesn't invalidate the Kiddushin. The Kiddushin is just fine. Why? Here we go. So we'll say, by the way, why is there not a date requirement by Kiddushin? Right? Isn't that kind of important to date documents in general, but also to date the Kiddushin document? We know that there's an obligation to date a get, but why is there no similar obligation to date Ishtar Kiddushin? Watch this. So we'll say, let's go a little bit into Gittin now. There are two reasons that the Gemara Maseches Gittin gives ultimately, again, for dating a get. One is because of Peros. I will say, if you look at Rashi, Hani Chalaman Damar, right across in Rashi, Begin Parakal Aget, Mipneimat Nuchacham Zman Begin Mishum Peri. Leida Me'emasai Tigba Miba'alo, Peros Sha'acham Nichse Mulug Shalah. So I will say, listen to this. The halacha is, or at least the Gemara quotes an opinion, that halacha l'maisa, a couple gets married. A wife brings in property. That property is called nichse malug. Nichse malug. That I will say, again, without getting into all the technicalities, nichse malug is property a woman brings into the marriage. She retains title over the property. Husband gets peros. Husband gets peros. Ultimately, again, when does husband have peros until? So there's a discussion about this in the Gemara, but there is an opinion that says once a man decides that he's going to divorce his wife, he really goes ahead and forfeits any more peros. I will say, because of that, it's important to have a date in the get. Because what does the date effectively represent? The cutoff of his usage of peros. Right? So I understand why you, so I will say, and now, I don't need that by Kiddushin. Why? Because Hani Chalamadar Mishum Peri Arusa less lay peri. I will say, generally we assume that when is a husband entitled to peros, to use the nichse mulug, to derive benefit from the property of the wife, only when nisuin. So therefore, again, it makes sense. So remember, again, a shtar kiddushin doesn't really need a date, because the whole purpose of the date is to prevent the husband from illegally benefiting from her property once they are divorced. That benefit only comes by nisuin. So if a husband is being mekadesh his wife with a shtar kiddushin, that shtar doesn't need a date. However, listen to this, Elamandar Mishubasachoso Liskinzman. Wow. But there's another opinion. Second opinion says, do you know why you need a date in the get? Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, Shemi Yikrape Abasachoso. Watch this case. Let's say a man is married to his niece. Man is married to his sister's daughter. And what happens? His wife commits adultery. So I will say, because he has a relationship with this woman, not just as his wife, but also what? It's his niece, meaning it's his sister's daughter. He may try to cover for her adultery. Now, what's a way you could cover for adultery? Give an undated get. Because think about this in just a moment. If you give an undated get, and witnesses come along and say, we saw Rachel commit adultery with Zvulun, what could Rachel do? Produce a document. It doesn't have a date. Okay, it doesn't. I was divorced. So Chazal instituted the need to put a date in the get in order that the get should not be abused in order to cover for adultery. Shemiechapa basachoso. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, now Bosai, you can make the same argument by a shtar kiddushin, right? You should require a date there also. Why? Because they're also what could happen if there is no date in the shtar kiddushin, right? Listen to this case. Ruvain is mekadesh Rachel, right? Ruvain is mekadesh Rachel. And then what happens? After kiddushin, husband, right? They're husband and wife. Right? They don't live together, but they're husband and wife. To the point that adultery is punishable by death even after kiddushin. Let's say now Rachel commits adultery. So we'll say, so again, how can if there is no date in the shtar kiddushin, then Rachel could claim that what? I wasn't mikudeshes yet. It's true, I had this relationship with the man. I'm sorry, it wasn't appropriate, but it wasn't adultery because I wasn't yet mikudeshes. Vaharai, the proof is there's no date. You can't tell me when I was or I wasn't. So shouldn't there be a need for a date in a shtar kiddushin as well? So we'll say, let's analyze this. Mishum de ikadem mekalish bekaspa, vikadem mekalish beshtara, lo takun rabban azman. See, we'll say inachinami. If shtar was the only vehicle for kiddushin, maybe I would agree with that. But since ultimately, again, people can be mekadesh with a shtar, or they can be mekadesh ultimately with money, ultimately, again, Chazal were not metakin as man. Amrli Rav Acha Breid Rav Yosef Ravashi Vaha Avdo Diika Dikani Bekaspa Viika de Beshtara V'Tikun Rabbanan Zman. I say, what about the purchases of servants? There are people who purchase servants with shtaros. There are people who purchase shtaros with money. But nevertheless, again, Chazal mandated that you have to put a date in the document of sale of an eved. So I'll say, so just because there's another mechanism of acquisition doesn't take away from the fact that you should have a date in the shtar, to which the Gemara says, Hasam ruba b'shtara, hachar ruba kas. We'll say, here's the difference. By avadim, the majority of people purchase avadim with a document. They will say, how do the majority of people affect kiddushin? Not with a shtar, but rather with what? With money. So because money is the primary vehicle to affect kiddushin, and shtar is not really as commonly used, Chazal did not feel the need to institute a date requirement ultimately by a shtar kiddushin. Furthermore, the Gemara says, Ibai Sema, Mishum Delo Efshar. Both say there's another reason. The truth is, you can't really effectively require a date obligation in the shtar kiddushin. Why not? Listen to this. Heichili Ovid. Because they both say, how does this play out? Literal saying is essentially who's holding the document of kiddushin, right? So say if she's holding on to the shtar kiddushin, even if you went ahead and you put a date in it, but if she wants to cover her tracks of adultery, what could she do? Right? Erase it. Just erase it. Just erase the date. Right? Lincha gabe didei. Ultimately, again, and if halacha l'maisa you keep the shtar kiddushin with the man, we run back to our previous problem. Zim debasa chosahi o mechape Allah. Ultimately, again, in the case of where he's married to his niece and he has rachmanas on her, maybe he'll erase the date. Linche gabe edim. What says this? He'll say, fine, let the witnesses hold on to the shtar kiddushin. Well, that doesn't work. I'll tell you why. Idi zechiri leisu lisod. If witnesses remember the date that the kiddushin was given, they could come testify. V'ilo, we'll say if they don't remember the date on their own, zimnin dechazu michtava v'asu mishadi. See, I will say this is fascinating. If the witnesses remember the date of the kiddushin, fantastic, come and testify. If they don't remember the date, what are we concerned about? That they're going to jog their memory based on what? Based on what? Looking at the shtar. And I will say, a witness is not permitted to give testimony based on jogging his memory from a written record. It's fascinating. If you're going to give testimony, you have to remember the events on your own without any other memory aids. In other words, if you need to look back at court transcripts, if you need to go ahead and look at a document to refresh your memory, your testimony is invalid. Listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Rachmana Amar, mi pihem v'lo mi pi ksavam." Torah says, we believe witnesses when they give testimony, but not based on a written record. To which the Gemara says, here, ihachi begerish shinami. So aren't we concerned with the same thing by a get? To which the Gemara says, hachi, so the Gemara says, ihachi begerish shinami nema hachi, hasam latzala didei kaasi, hacha lechova didakasi. Also, here's the difference. Ultimately, again, in the case of gerushin, ultimately, again, it's to the benefit of the wife. In the case of kiddushin, it would be to her detriment. See, I both say, in the case ultimately again of gerushin, halacha l'maisa, the erasure of the date ultimately is there to benefit her. By kiddushin, it would ultimately be a detriment. I both say, so let me just bring this together. So first of all, halacha l'maisa, how do we pass this? So I say, first of all, we know that actually there is ideally a date requirement both in a get as well as in a shtar kiddushin. That's an aside. I will say, but halacha l'maisa, let's go back to the Mishnah because I want to close this out now. How do we pass halacha l'maisa in the Mishnah? So I will say, the Mishnah's case, we had safek kiddushin, safek gerushin. Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. Rachel is his niece, Reuven's wife, Reuven's sister, Reuven's daughter. Leah is unrelated. Now I will say, what happened in the Mishnah? Reuven had either safek kiddushin or safek gerushin with Rachel, and before the safek could get resolved, Reuven dies. So we'll say, what's our shayla? What is Leah's obligation vis-a-vis Yibum? We'll say very simple, not very simple, but the Rambam Hilchos Yibum v'chalitza parak vav halacha chav beis haisazu she'erva alayava mikudeshes la'achiv shemes b'safek ol migureshes mimenu b'safek. Ultimately, again, choletzes v'lo misyadenes. That's how the Rambam paskins. In any case of safek gerushin or safek kiddushin, we tell the co-wife, we tell ultimately the unrelated wife, she does chalitza, and yibum is illegal. We'll stop here. Pick up at the Mishnah Mir Hashem tomorrow. Incredible. All right, Chevron Zoom, Moshe Ben Sion, great to see you. Michael, great to see you. Have a good day, everyone.